Hey, what's up, New Life? It's Coach Conder, aka Campus Pastor Preston. Football season's here, and so I got on my coaching gear. I'm going to be walking our guys through the basics and the fundamentals on the football field to help them as athletes. And so today I figured, hey, I want to get on the whiteboard just like I would with my guys and talk through the basics and fundamentals of the Bible. I know for a lot of us as followers of Jesus, we want to read and understand the Bible. The problem is, I don't know if you've ever felt this, I know I have, the Bible's a really big book. And it's kind of confusing, and at times I feel overwhelmed that I don't know where to start. I don't know, what I'm reading, and so there's a book that's been really helpful to me. Brett recommended this to the staff a couple weeks ago, and it's a guy named Max Anders and his book, 30 Days to Understanding the Bible. So I would recommend get this book. It's really going to bless you. It's going to help you. We're going to do some videos just walking through the book. And so today, in this first video, we're going to talk about the key that Max Anders says, which is the structure of the Bible. He said if you can understand the structure of the Bible, then you can start to understand the Bible itself. And so we're just going to talk through this. So starting with the whole Bible, I'm going to quiz you guys, so give me the answer. How many major divisions are there in the Bible? That's right, there's two. There's the Old Testament and the New Testament. That's right. All right, here's where we get a little trickier. How many books are there in the whole Bible? Did you get it? It's 66. 66 total books. Now, how many books are in the Old Testament? If you don't know, here's an easy way to remember it. How many letters are in the word old? 3. How many letters are in the word testament? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. How many books are there in the Old Testament? 39. 39 books in the Old Testament. Okay, so if there's 66 total books and 39 are in the Old Testament, how many are in the New Testament? If you're like me, you probably struggle with math. So let's give you a cheat for this. Personally, if you're like me, we like the Old Testament, but let's be honest, the New Testament, it's many times better. It's many times better. We love the New Testament, right? So if there's 3 and 9, 39, well, what's 3 times 9? 27. So the New Testament, it's many times better. That's just a joke. If you prefer the Old Testament, don't get upset with me. There's 27 books. So 66 total, 39, and 27. Awesome. So now we're going to talk through the Old Testament and get into it a little bit more. I'm going to switch markers for this. All right, so in the Old Testament, there's 39 books. You can take all of the Old Testament and break it down into 3 categories of books. There's 3 types of sections or buckets in the Old Testament. So here's how the Old Testament breakdown would look. There's 17 of what we would call historical books. So this is, like the name sounds, this is the history of the Old Testament, the story from creation through the people of God, Israel, all the way up to the birth of Jesus in the New Testament. So this is the history. This is the storyline. So in other words, you could start in Genesis and you could go all the way to Esther, and that's the story of the Old Testament. If you just read Genesis through Esther, you know the whole story of the Old Testament. Now, there's 2 other types of books. There are 5 poetical books. So if the historical's the story, the poetical books, you could say, are the songs. The songs and the poems. So in other words, from Job to Song of Solomon, or Song of Songs, depending on your translation, all of these 5 books can fit somewhere into the storyline. so that you can place them in the storyline in a certain place. So you've got historical books, poetical books. This is the story. These are the songs. And then finally, the last category, there's 17 prophetical books. So from Isaiah to Malachi, or the Italian prophet Malachi, as we like to call him. That's a joke. Sorry for the bad joke. There's prophetical books, which if the historical tells the story, the poetical are the songs, the prophetical book are the sermons. So these are messages God gave to His prophets to share to His people. A lot of times they tell them to repent and stop doing sinful things. So these are the sermons. So again, you can take the songs and the sermons and you can place them at certain spots along the timeline. Most of them are towards the end, especially the prophetical books. We'll talk about this later. Happens during the period of exile, primarily during that time period roughly. So, how many books in the whole Bible? Say it with me. 66. How many books in the Old Testament? 39. How many books in the New Testament? 27. 3 categories of the Old Testament. What are they? Historical, poetical, prophetical. 17 historical, Genesis to Esther. 5 poetical, Job to Song of Solomon. And 17 prophetical, from Isaiah to Malachi. Now, last thing we're going to do in this first video on the structure is talk about the New Testament. So the New Testament also has 3 categories that we could just break all of it down into. So the first one has 5 books, and this is once again historical. So this is the Gospel according to Matthew through the 4 Gospels, and ends with the book of Acts, the Acts of the Apostles. That's the history. Now, the Old Testament, it lasted over a 2,000 plus year time frame. The New Testament is less than 100 years. So this is really important to understand the time of what we're talking about here. The next, there's 13 Pauline epistles. So what do we mean by that? There's 13 letters, epistles, just another word for letter, that Paul, the Apostle Paul, wrote to churches or to individuals. So from Romans all the way to Philemon, those are the 13 letters that Paul wrote. And this is primarily for instruction. It's telling people what to believe and what to do who are Christians. And then finally, the last, there are 9 general epistles. From Hebrews, who we don't really know the author, to Revelation. Now, the general epistles are just any of the other letters that weren't written by Paul. So there's Peter, James, John, unknown authors. But when we look at the New Testament, again, 3 categories. Matthew to Acts, these 5 books, tells the story, the history of the New Testament. Romans to Philemon are 13 letters that were written by the Apostle Paul to churches and individuals. And then the last category, there's 9 general epistles from Hebrews to Revelation. So as you're thinking about the Bible and understanding what is this book about, how do I live it, how do I share it with others, a great place to start is by understanding the structure.